We'll now be looking at some of this sort of media-based stuff with both Charlie Winter, Ben Smith, and Andrea Figueroa. And so I'll turn it over to Ben and Andrea for their presentation, please.
On behalf of Ben and I, I'd like to thank you guys for having us here today. We're both really excited to be talking about part of a larger project that focuses on media constructions of terrorist organizations. This part is entitled Ideological Motives, Failures of Differentiation Within the Print Media. But before we start, I want to continue a trend that's been going on today and start with a conversation about the esteemed Donald J. Trump. So to begin, these comments by Mr. Trump, there were a lot to choose from for this slide, by the way. In addition to many more he's made like it, brought criticism from terrorism experts like former U.S. counterterrorism and intelligence officer Malcolm Nance, who argued that Trump's rhetoric was detrimental to counterterrorism and anti-terrorism missions around the world. So Nance's response focuses largely on the implications of Trump's rhetoric, but ignores what we argue to be, or what we believe to be, another equally important component of Trump's message: what drove him to say it in the first place. Given the information that Trump, and by extension all of the non-elite public, have about Daesh, is this sort of response reasonable? Or at the very least, is it consonant with what the public understands Daesh to be? Is sending 30,000 troops and bombing the quote-unquote shit out of Daesh totally and completely disconnected from what the public's reality of how to best combat the terrorist threat? In effect, is he wrong when he says that this is how we should fight Daesh? Well, yeah, obviously he's wrong about most things, but a larger point is that his extreme rhetoric can at least partially be attributed to what is known publicly about the current terrorist threat, specifically Daesh. And as we argue in this presentation, this public knowledge comes primarily from the media. So drawing on two lines of research here, terrorism scholarship and media scholarship, we kind of made two assumptions going into this project. The first is that the news shapes many opinions that the average consumer, or the average American consumer, has on complex topics like terrorism. The second is that journalists use media frames in order to more easily convey meaning. So these frames in turn shape how the public at large understands, for example, terrorism, and terrorist organizations. So, as many of you I'm sure know, the more often the same frames are used, the more entrenched they are in the public consciousness. So if time and time again, the same framing package is used in relation to, for example, the functional motives of Al-Qaeda or Daesh, the greater influence that that frame has on our, or the public's understanding of that organization. So what? What does it matter if what the public knows about that organization is derivative of what is conveyed to them by the media? Well, aside from the fact that public opinion in a democracy has, I don't know, some sort of normative value, public perceptions of terrorism can have policy implications, given that individuals who are more fearful of being victims of a terror attack are more likely to support more aggressive counterterrorism measures. So as evident by this Gallup polling data, Americans today are more displeased with the administration's handling of terrorism, of the terrorism threat more generally, at any point since 9/11, and of course since Daesh entered the public consciousness. So I want to draw your attention to the top line and the orange line here. And as we can see right now, more Americans are displeased than are pleased, essentially. This trend is not evident in the years directly following 9/11, when Al-Qaeda was the focus of the U.S. The nation's counterterrorism strategies, indicating that at that time there was at least some consensus between non-elites and elites alike that the actions used to combat Al-Qaeda were the most effective. So an argument can be made here is that the public is currently unhappy. Then if the public is currently unhappy, then they feel that the administration's chosen, or what they say is their chosen policy of contain and degrade, is ineffective at best. But more to the point, the current strategy is a long-term one. And if public support for the policy is already low, it will continue to wane with time. This creates room for the rhetoric of my friend here, Donald Trump, or Ted Cruz, and many others who argue for more extreme counterterrorism measures. So, if the media in their reporting of Daesh fails to capture the nuances of this emerging terrorist threat, Media consumers are not only left with a poor, very poor understanding of what Daesh is, but of also what policies to combat them are the most appropriate. Who then is ultimately responsible for the public's misunderstanding of that group, and where do the roots of this misunderstanding manifest? In this presentation, we contend that there is a severe disconnect between how Daesh is reported on in the American press, print press, and the strategies of the current administration is using to combat them. So moreover, this disconnect emerges in media text through the framing of Daesh as an existential threat, driven entirely by a singular ideological motive. And with that, I turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Ben.
So as Andrea discussed, there's a disconnect between the general public and the policy elites as it pertains to preferred solutions to the challenge faced by Daesh. This is in contrast to the period following 9/11, when the general public and policy elites were generally aligned in their thinking about how to combat al-Qaeda. Given that al-Qaeda was in large part the frame used to originally understand Daesh, and given the similarities in tactics used to combat these two organizations, we're taking the approach of comparing media framing of these two organizations in order to help inform as to why there is a disconnect now and not then. Before I discuss what we did and what we found, I wanted to very briefly describe the goals of our research. First and foremost, our goal has been to identify and explicate the repertoire of attributes and attribute frames used by journalists when writing about specific terrorist organizations and actors. This is a large project encompassing multiple different organizations, but for today, our focus is on Daesh and al-Qaeda. We're using our research to answer the following set of questions that you see up on the slide. First, and most basically, how do journalists construct a meaningful understanding of Daesh and al-Qaeda and a meaningful understanding of these organizations' actions? Second, what are the similarities and differences between the framing of these two organizations? And most importantly, how can attribute framing help to inform about the disconnect between public opinion and elite opinion? So I promised that I would run through methodology as quickly as possible. I don't want to bore anyone to death, so just really quickly, we're looking specifically at mentions of Daesh and al-Qaeda that are in the Wall Street Journal and New York Times that were published between 2013 and 2014. The unit of analysis is the sentence. So we're looking at the grammatical and syntactical construction of the coding unit to determine both explicit and implicit meanings. And finally, for those who are interested, coding was conducted using a constant comparative qualitative method. Now, I'm going to be briefly walking through the results of our investigation now, but given the time constraints of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing the discussion specifically on the key areas of distinction between al-Qaeda and Daesh. Now, the core of our argument is that for any organization, behaviors are shaped by goals or motives. And if you understand the motives of an organization, you understand most other parts of the organization as well. And while it may not be possible to understand the actual motives of a complex organization like Daesh or al-Qaeda, perceptions of motives play a big role in shaping public understanding of the organizations. Perceptions of motive, along with observed behaviors of the organization, drive perceptions of functional attributes and structural attributes of the organization. In other words, how the organization operates and what they're doing. From these perceived functional and structural attributes, and in relation with the perceived motives, we derive our evaluations of the organization. Among these evaluations of the type of threat posed by groups like al-Qaeda and Daesh. The first clear area of differentiation between al-Qaeda and Daesh is in motivational attributes. Now, al-Qaeda's been around for a while, and as such, there's a relatively speaking robust understanding of their motives within the media press. We were able to identify 4 distinct and entirely separate motivations differentially applied to al-Qaeda, as shown on the slide. Now, in contrast, Daesh has only been in the public consciousness for a relatively short period of time, perhaps explaining the relatively simple understanding of their motives. In fact, across the nearly 1,000 coding units we analyzed, Daesh was framed as having only one real motive, the creation of Islamic utopia. Often there was cursory acknowledgement that this motive was derivative of their ideological motivations, but in contrast to al-Qaeda, these ideological motivations are almost never explicated, and again are completely understood within the driving motivation of the creation of the Islamic State. Derivative of the primary motive, we were also able to identify 2 sub-motives, which we are tentatively calling an imperialist motivation and a purification motivation. The motives of the 2 organizations, in connection with the organization's observed behaviors, help drive the framing of the functional and organizational attributes. This is especially clear when we look at Daesh. They are framed as having a military function, a government or administrative function, and a criminal or cartel-like function, all derivative of the imperialistic submotive. And alternatively, they are framed as having a proselytizing function, a branding function, and a terrorist function, all derivative of what we're calling the purification submotive. Now, when we compare this with al-Qaeda, we again see some rather stark differences, although we also start to see some more similarities. The biggest difference is that with al-Qaeda, there's a large emphasis on the way the group is organized, whereas we don't see any of this type of conversation when looking at Daesh. Now, this may be because the organizational structure of Daesh is unknown, or because there is no interest in explicating it within the print media. Now, when we specifically look at the functional attributes of al-Qaeda, we see a lot of similarities, but almost always with very slight differences. For example, al-Qaeda is framed as a movement, whereas Daesh is framed as a brand. Both types of frames are similar in that they discuss the more ephemeral functions of the organization, but also starkly different in their connotation. As discussed earlier, the functional attributes in connection with the perceived motives help to drive evaluations of these organizations. The evaluative attributes of Daesh are much more contested and diverse than they are with al-Qaeda, which may be attributable to the fact that al-Qaeda has been in the public conscious for much longer, and as such, the public may have a more strongly shared conceptualization of the group. Now, while we can see some very clear differences between these two groups as we compare the evaluative attributes, there is one area that bears specific focus as it applies to the question of why there's a disconnect between the general public and the administration, and that is perceptions of threat. Both organizations are framed as being a threat. In the case of al-Qaeda, they are framed primarily as an extraordinary threat and as an enemy. However strong this framing may be, however, it pales in comparison to the framing of Daesh. Over and over again, we see discussion of the extent to which Daesh threatens to upend the status quo. Their ideology is framed as an intrinsic threat, while the organization is framed as being an existential threat as it pertains to the status quo, especially within the Middle East, but also to the United States and to the West in general. While al-Qaeda has long been seen as an extraordinary threat that must be combated, Daesh is framed as being a threat to our very way of life and to our very existence. Now, this difference is important because it may help explain why the public is less than satisfied with the current administration's strategy of contain and degrade. And it may help explain why the vitriolic language of individuals like Trump and Cruz has such staying power. If the group is an existential threat, then there's really only one solution within the public mind, and that's eradication. Thus, the discussion of carpet bombing the entire region, rounding up all those who may have any sympathies to the group, etc. Now, I'm personally of the opinion that Daesh is not necessarily an existential threat. While the organization must be combated, only a long-term strategy will work. But given the framing of Daesh in the American media, it's hardly surprising that the general public seems to disagree. The problem is that the current policy of contain and degrade is not a natural fit to perceptions of the organization as an existential threat. If the administration believes that their preferred policy really is the best policy for combating Daesh, then they must do a better job communicating to the public why their policy is able to properly address the threats posed by the organization, and more so, communicate to the public a more nuanced understanding of the organization, which does not necessarily lead to the conclusion that the group truly is an existential threat. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much to the both of you. I'll shift our focus in media to the offline.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting presentation. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. I'll certainly be asking some Qs. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack here. I'm going to look at what IS is doing offline. We hear an awful lot about its online communications, its gory videos that are splayed across CNN, BBC on an almost weekly basis. But we don't really hear about what it's doing offline. And I think that that's to the detriment of the coalition's attempts to undermine it. So broadly, IS disseminates propaganda online to legitimize itself, propagate the movement, and intimidate its enemies. Offline, though, it's doing something different. And offline, I'm looking at IS, the insurgent group, not IS, the terrorist group. So I've pieced together a fairly decent argument, I like to think, that it's pursuing a totalitarian strategy of communications, which is very reminiscent of past totalitarians. So this is based on legislation which is publicized by IS online, be it in Darbic or its Arabic language newspaper An-Naba, documents that are leaked by dissidents in the caliphate itself, a longitudinal propaganda archive which has many thousands of bits of data in it, which, when taken in aggregate, is very, very useful in seeing how this strategy has developed. Finally, I spoke to people in Raqqa, Palmyra, Deir ez-Zor, and Mosul, as well as Ramadi. So, My argument is based on three things: infrastructure, censorship, and message, the three prongs of IS's totalitarian strategy. First of all, the infrastructure. We've got a large quantity of media-producing outlets, original media-producing outlets. The extent of their centralization is something which is often ignored or overlooked, but evidently they're putting a lot of resources into this. Here's a little map which shows the extent of IS's media infrastructure. Each of these boxes has its own media office, in theory. So I say in theory because it could just be being produced in one room in, say, Syria, but having a different label. But either way, it's a pretty formidable operation. When it's delivering propaganda offline, it does this through media kiosks, media points, which there's quite a lot of evidence on in its propaganda. So this is a screen grab from Anaba. It's offline newspaper, which is disseminated by hand on Saturdays in Iraq and Syria and Libya, and also circulated electronically on Tuesdays by its official media outlet on Telegram. But essentially, these are institutions from which propaganda, be it audio, visual, written, is disseminated. People go to them to pick up the latest in IS propaganda or watch the latest in IS propaganda. Often they're not coerced to go. People will go voluntarily, and this is a conversation I had with a tribal fighter in Ramadi. He was speaking about his family members who were very much opposed to IS. They would go to the media kiosk in order to show that they were not a threat to IS in terms of undermining its strategy there. They vary greatly in terms of their sophistication. Some are literally just a Winnebago or white van which drives around remote areas of Iraq and Syria. Then in Raqqa, you have ones which are literally open-air cinemas with leather upholstery, really quite flashy. The other interesting thing is that they are established in new territories that IS takes over within a matter of days. So when Ramadi was taken, it took 4 days for these media points to be established, 4 days for the citizens who stayed in Ramadi to end up watching IS videos, certainly not buying into the IS narrative, but being force-fed the IS narrative. Same was the case in Palmyra, 3 days it was. Here are some media points. So the range of things that we have here, this one's actually in Libya, which is interesting because it's slightly rarer to have media points outside of the IS heartlands, which is, again, testament to the fact that it may all call itself IS, but it's certainly not homogeneous. We have printing materials. This is the magazine Maysara being burned onto hard disks, and also flash drives are handed out with the material too. So what's being shown at these media kiosks? Photo reports, videos, radio. Radio is being blasted out on loudspeakers, which is something that I didn't realize until I spoke to someone in Raqqa, who said that people are forced to listen to Ida'at al-Bayan on a daily basis. These places are set up in town squares on the main streets, and they blast out, whether it's nasheeds, whether it's daily bulletins on the military prospects, whether it's interviews with leaders within IS. The influence of Ida'at al-Bayan is really pervasive. Magazines, so not just Darbic, but Turkish, Russian, French, English, Arabic magazines. Newspapers, this is An-Naba, which is the thing that I was talking about earlier. Tends to have about 16 pages, always 2 infographics, very, very dense, but tells a story of momentous expansionism, aggression. It obviously sticks to the things that serve IS's narrative. And Da'wah materials, theological reasons for its existence, why the caliphate is legitimate. Anashid and recitations. The next thing that I'm going to look at, having laid out very quickly the infrastructure, obviously I could talk about this forever really, is censorship. So this is something which is being undertaken with a very large dose of gradualism. It's not something which IS imposes immediately in the areas that it expands into. And that's because IS is an insurgent group. It's trying to keep people on side. It doesn't want to take out internet, mobile phones immediately because it doesn't want to alienate the local population immediately. But what it has been doing is making things more difficult. So internet is no longer so easy to come by, certainly not if it's private access, and increasingly so if it's public access. In Raqqa, for example, there used to be, because of the nature of the internet in Raqqa during the Syrian war, a very large network of informal internet cafes run off satellite-based internet was established over the last few years. IS has systematically worked to close down that internet infrastructure. So now there are just 10 internet cafes. I mean, they're basically large rooms with a load of computers in them and wireless, within which people can access the internet. These are monitored by intelligence operatives of IS, and clearly they want to make sure that people are only looking at the stuff that they're producing and only talking about the stuff that they want them to talk about. Satellite dishes. As well as internet, satellite dishes have been effectively waged war against by IS. First of all, rhetorically. So we'd see a lot of messages like this. This is a statement essentially saying why satellite dishes are illegal, why they are dangerous to Islam as a religion. And I mean, it's ridiculous when you actually read it. But they are implementing this more and more on a month-by-month basis. Again, there's a lot of disparity between how this censorship strategy is being implemented. We know that they want to implement it across Iraq and Syria. To a lesser extent in Libya, they're trying to, but again, they're aware of the limitations. But in Raqqa, for example, satellite dishes are actively being destroyed. Ahead of Ramadan, the implementation of this policy is getting a lot stricter too. So they're moving in that direction. They are pursuing a full monopolization of the media. And I think that, again, this is something which is overlooked a great risk. Now, as for the message itself, so I showed you that diagram, that map of the various media-producing organizations of IS as they are dispersed across the world, or as IS wants us to think they are. A huge amount of media is produced. I mean, we're talking 38 to 40 media events every day, so photo reports, videos, audio bulletins, magazines, newspapers. I mean, it's a huge amount of material. It looks very varied. It, by all accounts, is very varied, but it is very much centralized. Only the official media producers of IS are making this media, and I think that's critical to understand. This is a very lined-up, tight message. When it comes to the themes, we have, I've done a lot of work on breaking down the overall narrative of IS, and we have amnesty, so people being forgiven for fighting for other groups and then being integrated into IS's ranks. Belonging, so the idea that if you join IS, you will join this group, this group of brothers. The idea of brotherhood is very important and something that they very much routinely emphasize in foreign language media more than Arabic language media. Ultraviolence, we all know about the ultraviolence. Victimhood. This is something which often appears alongside ultraviolence as a way of justifying the acts that follow. So anyone who's unfortunate enough to have watched the immolation of the Jordanian pilot will know that the key part of that video was the dead children, dead old people, that the images of them that had been syncopated into the video itself as a way of justifying why this man was going to be burned alive. War, the aggressive caliphate, the professional army of the Islamic State, showing the various legions of IS, wherever they are, taking weaponry off the Crusader coalition and really taking the fight to them. Of late, there's been more of an emphasis on the anti-aircraft defenses of IS. Again, I think this is indicative of the fact that they respond to on-the-ground events, and they are trying to show that they can actually do something to push back against the coalition. This is the most important one for me, civilian life, and it does appear most of the time. Just today, I was looking, as I tend to do most hours of every day, I was looking at what new propaganda had been released, and there was a photo report, 25 photo report of an ice cream factory in Mosul. I mean, this isn't surprising anymore. It's something that you always see, this focus on civilian life, this focus on the IS utopia. Now, I don't actually think that the people living under IS believe this. Okay, sure, maybe some of the ideologues do, maybe the leaders do, but the masses, the millions of people that live under IS, of course they don't believe this. It's, again, falling into this totalitarian communication strategy, conveying an unreality and inhibiting rebellion, dissent at its earliest forms, really trying to stop the organic formation of public opinion. Of course, supporters are excited by the aggression, they're excited by the violence, they're excited by the pictures of horses in nice fields outside Mosul. But for opponents, what they see is the constant, ubiquitous images of people having their hands cut off, of people having their heads cut off, of alleged spies wherever they are, from Libya to Syria to Afghanistan. There is a kind of routine, ubiquitous, sterilized approach towards dealing with these individuals. And I think that that's designed to really hobble dissent at its earliest stages. Another important point is that everything we see online, so forget about the stuff that you see in the media, but the stuff which is being delivered on Telegram, for example, that I look at every day, that's not the extent of it. In Iraq and Syria, there's a lot of videos and photographs which are being circulated which have nothing to do with what is being portrayed online, and they focus a lot on what's happening in a post-IS Ramadi, a post-IS Tikrit. They focus on what the Shia militias are doing to civilians that were living under IS. So in Mosul, that's the key narrative at the moment. It's not utopia necessarily, it's the threat of retribution. And that, again, is falling into IS's totalitarian communication strategy. I think the key thing for me is that IS's propaganda isn't actually as unprecedented as everyone always talks about it being. As part of this project, I delved into the kind of theoretical literature on totalitarian communications, but also I looked closely at the Nazi example. And there are a lot of parallels there, both in terms of the infrastructure and the message. The Nazis had media points, media kiosks. They even had mobile media kiosks, 1,000 of them that roamed throughout Germany, showing the newsreels that the Nazis spent so much time putting together. Propagandists were involved in the earliest stages of military planning, the earliest stages of tactical planning. So, for example, when Norway was invaded in 1939, I think it was, 300 cameramen were attached to the German forces as they invaded. Now, the British, they sent one cameraman. I mean, it's interesting, the parallel. I mean, I'm obviously not saying that IS is a Nazi organization, but I am saying that they have some very strong similarities in what they're doing in terms of propaganda. The message, and I'll finish very quickly, the message as well, that the Nazi promise of the revival of the community, the revival of the national identity. I don't speak German, so I'm not going to try and pronounce that and get it wrong, but that's something which again is reflected in IS's promise of returning the Ummah to its utopian state, its rightful state. Hatred of the other, whether it's Jews or Shiites, and also the concept of retaliation. This is something which I think differs slightly. So towards the end of the Second World War, in Nazi propaganda, there is a big focus on Vergeltung, which is essentially retaliation. So the promise of some war-changing weapon that could defeat the Allies in one fell swoop. And it was something which constantly came up in propaganda, increasingly as the Germans were faring worse on the battlefield. Now, this is something which is also being reflected in IS propaganda. They're saying that we'll take the fight to the Crusaders. They're saying that we'll send our people to fight the Crusaders and kill them in their homeland and kill the Kafar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas the Nazis couldn't pull it off, it seems that IS have a better ability to, in that they can carry out an attack in, say, Paris or Brussels, or even have a supporter in America who has no operational connection to the organization, pledge allegiance to Baghdadi and then kill someone in, at least its terms, IS's name. And I think its ability to project itself and promise and actually follow through on this retaliation is incredibly important in looking at the organization's sustained appeal to its ideological supporters. I think that's my last slide. It's not my last slide. But there's a lot of text on this, so I'll leave it so we can go to the Q&A.
No, you got a couple minutes if you want to wrap up.
Pardon?
You got a couple minutes if you want to wrap up.
Okay, cool. Well, this is just one quote that a guy called Paul Kexkometti wrote about Nazi and Soviet propaganda that I thought was really, really interesting. Again, looking at it offline, he said that every part of, in this case it was the Nazi narrative, is designed to enhance respect for the totalitarian government, to generate approval of its policies and to silence doubts as to the power, benevolence, wisdom, and cohesion of the ruling clique. And that is something, again, which is being directly reflected in what IS is doing offline right now. And I think it's really useful to look at it in a comparative context, not to look at it as something which is unprecedented, unparalleled, and just came out of nowhere, but to really look at what's happened before and look at the trajectory of the movements that were implementing similar communication strategies to see how we could think about countering it better, or at least understanding it better. And now I'll finish it there. Thank you.
Right, well, thanks to all the presenters for, first off, keeping well under time. Because I know there's the new generation of academics, they actually listen to the instructions, but thank you very much. But equally, it gives us plenty of space and plenty of time for questions. And I'm certain, no doubt, there's a fair few, so who would like to get us going?
Thanks for these really interesting presentations. So I have a couple of questions for Charlie, and I'm sorry because I'm going to ask a question that you sort of started out by saying you weren't answering. But I mean, how do you see do you think that there are fundamental differences between the online and offline media? I mean, I know you only covered the offline media, but again, if you have anything to add there. And also I'm wondering, I mean, the kind of categories that you laid out, in terms of like civilian life, ultraviolence, et cetera. Do you see, I mean, I guess I'm thinking about the like chopping off of the hands, for instance, as being, I mean, it's ultraviolence, but it also sort of contributes to representing a sort of governance or rule of law or state building. If you see that as being kind of comprised in the other categories or potentially a new category.
I will start with the second one first. So that's a really good question. I actually class the beheadings of people who have carried out civil crimes, so people who have stolen things or murdered people. I categorize that as part of the utopian narrative, so the civilian life narrative. When I talk about ultraviolence, I'm specifically here referring to when it is IS executioners killing supposed agents of the far enemy, so individuals who are working for the Iraqi government, which is in turn working for the Crusader Coalition, etc., etc. But I do see a difference between someone's hand being cut off in a civilian context and someone being killed for a media production like the one that I showed earlier, which involved the Paris attackers. And I think also another useful way of trying to gauge whether something should be classed in the so-called ultraviolence narrative or the civilian life one is looking at the actual media production unit itself. So Al Hayat Media Center or the Furqan Foundation, for example, those are two organizations which present the most high-profile videos. Usually if Al Furqan Foundation creates a video, it gets broadcast across the world, projected by Western media, because it is directly targeting a Western media audience. And I think that that's one of the key issues over the last few years as to how we've come to understand IS, how we've come to frame it, which I really enjoyed your presentation because you spoke exactly about this, the fact that IS's propaganda is really leading its way in terms of how we in the West or we in the international community end up understanding the group. So I think if that can be kind of unpacked a bit, then we'd do a great deed there. In terms of the differences between online and offline media, yes, there is a massive difference. And I think that online we see, I mean, usually it's about 40 or 50% of the time it's kind of civilian life. So the ice cream shops or people being punished in the street, or mosques, yeah, charity distributed is a big one, but also wildlife and very weird things like that. Yeah, or the rare bird conservation center. I mean, it's very, very varied. And then you have everything else in kind of descending order, so militarism, victimhood, etc. Offline, I think it's different, because offline they are stressing what will happen if IS loses. So in Mosul, again, I'm focusing mainly on Mosul here because the conversation I had with an individual in Mosul about this was in quite a lot of detail about what IS is broadcasting to the rest of, or to the population of Mosul in terms of the risk of retribution, the dangers that it still faced from the Iraqi government, from forces who are currently fighting alongside the Iraqi government. And that was overwhelmingly the main theme that was coming through in the media there. And that's not something that we see online. That's not something which ever really makes it into IS online propaganda unless it's being used in the run-up to someone being beheaded or something like that.
You just kind of answered my first question about the difference between online and offline. Methodologically, it seems like online, from this presentation at least, online is still kind of a intermediary for you in your methodology. The sources, the pictures, all seem to have happened online. I don't know if you had a phone conversation with somebody in Raqqa, but if that was online, it still seems like online is still a methodological intermediary. So what is the qualitative difference between online and offline material, since the same material you said is sent on Saturday and then posted online on Tuesday? Is the only difference between online and offline this retribution, or is it something else?
I would love to be able to answer that question in a huge amount of detail, but obviously when speaking with someone who is living under IS in, be it Mosul or Raqqa or Deir ez-Zor, or formerly living under them in Palmyra, there's certain limitations to the extent of detail they'll go into. But one thing which they were very adamant about, and this was across the board with all of the interviewees, was that the propaganda being broadcast online was not the full extent of IS's propaganda, and that's because there is a different audience. I mean, of course, a lot of the things will be interesting or desired by ideological supporters of the group across the board, but for the civilian population that IS is trying to keep acquiescent, that is trying to really just keep in this status quo of not rebelling and being afraid of dissent, and coupling all of its propaganda messaging with the threat of terror, with the threat of punishment. I think that that's the key thing here, that IS is cognizant of the fact that its propaganda that focuses on utopia and aggression and all of that isn't enough to maintain this level of acquiescence. They're also cognizant of the fact that they are successful in keeping hold of a lot of these territories because the local population sees them as the least worst option, sees them as a better option to living under sheer majority rule, whether that's right or wrong. And that is, to a large extent, because of the evidence that they can point towards, whether it's Abu Israel, who's a very kind of prominent Shia militia fighter, cutting someone's leg like a shawarma after burning him alive. I mean, these videos circulate, and they circulate like wildfire. And they're being used a lot offline as well. It's something which we need to really focus about in choosing our partners as part of the coalition, whether they are Shia militias or otherwise. We need to be cognizant of the fact that IS listens to what is being said, and they also listen and look out for things which will play into their narrative. So I hope that's kind of answered your question. I mean, it's never going to be as comprehensive as I'd like it to be, but that's because I can't just pick up the phone and talk to people in the caliphate whenever, and they are limited in what they can do as well.
I've got two questions, one for Ben and Andrea. What do you think the leadership or the president or our government can do to kind of eliminate the misperceptions that you talked about IS predominantly? I thought it was interesting how you paralleled the Al-Qaeda with IS. So I was interested, we're not going to launch a campaign that Charlie's just been talking about. So how exactly does it get done? The whole CV stuff sometimes looks like it's in the way too hard to do category. And then the second question would be for Charlie, how far back have you looked at the Islamic State historically, and what would you consider to be their largest innovation from a media perspective going back? Anyways, that's it. Thank you.
So on the question of what can be done, I think it really comes down to, it does come down to communication, and it comes down to deliberate communication. So part of what we'd hope can occur is oftentimes the use of frames is an unconscious act. We don't realize we're using certain frames to describe certain actions. We don't realize kind of where that might be leading it. And so obviously that we have the challenge that these frames have been out in the public for a while now, so they're starting to become more and more adopted. We're hearing many of them in the conversation today because it's easier to talk about it that way. It's easier to talk about it within a framing construct. So it's more being conscious when you're crafting policy statements, when you're crafting press releases and et cetera that actually discuss the activities of the organization or counterterrorism policies, being careful and deliberate about how you craft those in order to make sure that you're not relying on that fallback language that's so easy to use.
To answer how far back I've gone, for this particular study, I went back to June 29, 2014, when the caliphate was declared. Beyond that, I mean, I've been monitoring it and kind of trying to get as good a handle on IS media for as long as possible. So not just when it was IS, but when it was ISIS and also ISI. But obviously, the media infrastructure has become a lot more sophisticated over recent years compared to what it used to be. So, for example, Furqan Foundation has been around for a very long time, since 2006, 2007, I think. But then the Hayat Media Center, that was 2014. The provincial media offices, 2014. So also for the purposes of this study, looking at what was being done offline, I think that in the wake of the caliphate announcement in 2014, a lot of what IS was trying to do in terms of its provision of governance solidified. It became more centralized, and the same can be kind of seen in what it was doing in terms of media. Everything suddenly became a lot more joined up, a lot more coordinated. In terms of the biggest kind of breakthrough in terms of what it's been doing on a propaganda basis, I think one thing that will always stick with me is the video that was released on the, I think it was the 17th of November 2014. It was 1 week to the day after 5 audio statements from Libya, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Algeria, and Sinai were released through IS media channels, pledging allegiance to Baghdadi. Now, in the week that followed, there was a very choreographed response to these pledges of allegiance, one which had clearly been rigged very, very carefully in advance. So 3 days after those 5 statements came out, Baghdadi released a statement accepting the allegiance of these groups to great fanfare. And this was received very well, obviously, by IS supporters, both online and offline. Then 4 days later, they continued that same promotional campaign and released 4 days later a video called Although the Disbelievers Dislike It, which is the same name, clumsily worded name, it sounds better in Arabic, of the Baghdadi speech. And this video was something which had been very carefully, again, very carefully put together. It was the video in which 22 Syrian airmen were beheaded. It was a video which showed the spread of the caliphate from Syria and Iraq across North Africa and then eastwards as well. And it was a video that clearly was not thrown together within 1 week. And I think that aside from the fact that that pointed towards a great deal of planning in how to make the most of these pledges, it was, in terms of its production and the kind of storyboarding of it, much more sophisticated as well. And one video that we hear a lot about is Salila Sawarim 4, the Clanging of the Swords 4, which was kind of stereotypical information operation ahead of the offensive to take Mosul and then a lot of the rest of Iraq as well, which was very gory, very well put together again, but it didn't have the stylistic elements that were present in Although the Disbelievers Dislike It. And I think that one thing which IS has managed to benefit from to a great degree from its influx of foreign fighters is human capital, people who know how to use post-production programs, people who know how to direct a film, basically. We see a gradual uptick in the quality of IS media across the board, whether it's from one of the central outlets or from a provincial outlet, whether they're using drones or whether they're using cranes, whether they're using post-production techniques. And that's something which is carried on for a very long time. One of the most important things in looking at IS media, for me, is that it is a learning organization, and it is learning very well, and it's very good at centralizing its best expertise. So whether that's done through one location where everything's being post-produced, or whether it's sending individuals out to do the actual filming and share expertise, that's a whole other question.
Hi, I'm Sarah Zeiger from Hidayah, the International Center of Excellence for Countering Violent Extremism. So I'm interested in counter-messaging and solutions. My question is for Charlie. Given the, I guess, themes that you kind of developed, the 5 themes, what are your recommendations in terms of counter-messaging? And specifically, the Global Coalition is meeting in Kuwait right now. So if you were to give top 3, top 5 recommendations to them for counter-messaging, what would they be?
Well, hopefully they're watching on Periscope now. So,
competing events.
I think that one thing that's happened over the last few years, which has been very beneficial, is there's been a move away from looking for this elusive counter-narrative towards looking for an alternative narrative. I mean, the jargon's quite heavy, but I think that alternative narrative is something which works a lot better because it doesn't give kind of a level of credibility to IS's own spiel. And I think that, yeah, sorry. And I think you mentioned the narratives, the fact that IS's story is a composite story, that it's a drawing together of many different things. I think that what that lends itself for is a holistic view of an alternative. It's promising not just the ability to fight someone, but the ability to live somewhere. People will go to join IS not just to end up killing themselves or die as a martyr, but they go there to live as well, to live in this utopia. Obviously, the amount of people that believe that they're going to live in a utopia is very small. It's not a successful mass movement, but there are those individuals who think that, and a lot of that evidence is gleaned from propaganda. So I think in terms of undermining this, in terms of flipping it on its head, of course, there's the whole thing of pointing out how brutal they are and saying they're not Islamic. I think there's a place for that. But that it simply can't just be left there. There needs to be an offer of something else. But also perhaps it's not just counter-messaging that we should be looking at, but actually presenting a real palpable alternative, so something that people can actually do. So something that provides this sense of community, this sense of collective identity, this very powerful set of themes that IS really promises its supporters, its potential supporters, reflecting that in kind of youth engagement and that kind of thing across the territories that are supplying a lot of recruits to IS as well.
I actually wanted to, just because we've been working together for a while, I want to just jog his memory a little bit with regard to Allison and Craig's question. One of the other big differences that Charlie didn't address, because he was talking about the offline strategy, is the huge discrepancy between what he's seeing in English and what he's seeing in Arabic. And so the Arabic stuff, which is exclusive, or so the English stuff, which is almost exclusively going to be the online, versus the Arabic materials, which is going to preponderantly be what is distributed offline. And so this is where a lot of that difference, that, you know, when you ask what's the biggest difference between on and offline, you're going to also see that correlated to some of the differences between what they produce in English and what they produce in Arabic. And so I don't want to spend too much time on that, but because your space, your headspace was in the Arabic, I think that is part of the answer as well.
Thank you. Charlie, what you bring up in terms of censorship and former totalitarian styles of achieving that, as you look at what's in the content of the offline publications, and given your comment that the counter narratives don't work from coming in from outside, what can you tell that is breaking through the censorship, and how is it coming through? I mean, what behaviors can you pick up from the way things are being expressed? What the fashion in which they're getting through? Is it, I mean, thumb drives, paper, whatever it is, and then how does the Islamic State deal with those not counter narratives, but information sources? So there are differences between censorship that totalitarian states have undertaken during war and the kind of pressure you feel, and the kind of normal breakdown of censorship that occurs because of simply not counter narratives, but flows of information that counter the vision that people have of what the outside world is doing, how concerned they are with what's going on inside the Islamic State, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's a lot of kind of mystery surrounding how IS and people within IS territories have such access to the internet. And I think that that's one of the keys to how we might perhaps think about challenging the group in terms of its information operations. I mentioned very briefly what's happened in the last few years in Raqqa, where the people of Raqqa have been trying to resist the Assad regime's attempts to censor them, the Assad regime's attempts to cut them off from internet. So in that context, this informal network of satellite-generated or satellite-powered Wi-Fi came to light. So essentially, you can buy these modems. I'm not a techie, so I'll muck up all the language, so I apologize in advance. But you can buy modems which you can essentially charge up with data in Turkey and then take back to, in this case, Raqqa. And then the internet that those modems provide is provided by satellite dishes. So the internet's not broadband or anything like that, but it is good enough to be able to access websites. It's good enough to be able to upload and download stuff. And there were 3, maybe 4 years almost of the citizens of Raqqa essentially really trying to sharpen this informal network and get around censorship entirely. So what IS has tried to do since it has taken control of the city, and as it's tried to implement that control even harder, is picking apart that informal network. And clearly it's failing because there are activists in Raqqa who are uploading photographs and writing news stories I mean, I'm speaking here about Raqqa as being slaughtered silently, but they are not the only ones. The work they're doing is fantastic, and I think that it's important to recognize the strains that they're going through in order to continue doing what they're doing. But they have access to the internet because of these little modems that you can charge up in Turkey, so through a black market way, essentially. So even though there are the 10 IS-administered internet cafes in Raqqa, there are a lot more access points for internet in Raqqa than that. In terms of the rest of the Caliphate territories, I mean, what's been particularly interesting as I've been researching for this is the discrepancy between what's happening in Raqqa and what's happening in Mosul. So it seems that in Mosul, there is a greater degree of care on the part of IS to avoid alienating the local population by taking away all of their satellite dishes, all of their access to internet immediately. And I think that that doesn't necessarily undermine IS's own propaganda, because a lot of the media in Arab media as well as Western media and all sorts really focuses on what's happening in Iraq after a territory gets taken back from IS. So it plays directly into IS's hands, again going back to this retribution, this retaliation narrative. And they are trying to stoke the flames of those fears as much as possible in order to demonstrate to the local population that if IS leaves, then they're in trouble, not just from the Shia militias, but the people who had to leave Mosul back in 2014. So it's a really complicated thing that isn't quite monopoly, or actually is very far from monopoly. But it's something which IS is still managing to leverage to its interests. One quick thing that I think would be really interesting in terms of opening up that communication space in the years to come to try and counteract IS's communications efforts are these. I went to Facebook's headquarters in Dublin a few months ago, and they had this Facebook propaganda room where they're showing off all the cool stuff that Facebook was doing. One of the things they showed was this, this massive drone, which flew far above commercial airliner heights. And it had this big kind of box on the bottom of it that swivels around. And it was able to provide internet through laser, so through clouds, and kind of you could choose a bit of the earth to provide internet to, and then the people in that bit of the earth would be able to access the internet. I mean, things like that could be used to open up the communication space again. I also think that there is space, at least some space, for going old-fashioned, dropping leaflets. It's something that's routinely mocked by, well, everyone. that the coalition is doing. But I think that dropping leaflets showing that people haven't been forgotten about, that there is this coalition that's trying to fight IS, I think that does have a place. I think one of the big problems of this area is people are very quick to discount any tactic that's being attempted at all just because it doesn't give a quick fix, it doesn't give a kind of one-size-fits-all strategy to win the war against IS.
I just want to go back on some of your points about control, but first over to Ben and Andrea, where you were talking about how there's little conversation right now in the press as to how Daesh is organized, whereas we talked a fair bit as to how Al-Qaeda was organized. Now, knowing how Al-Qaeda was organized hasn't helped defeat it in any way, but I'm just wondering how the conversation on how they are organized can be improved through more information, but also to you, Charlie, does the propaganda talk about how Daesh has created the perfect caliphate, how they have a great system of governance, and you were talking about how a lot of it is fear of the alternatives. So do they talk about how they're structured, how they are organized? And I wonder if there's any sort of opportunity to kind of take this information and feed it into the American media and press.
First of all, I wanted to answer yes to that last, that last one. So the question of the long-term discussion of organizational structure. Now, I don't necessarily know that that's inherently bad thing or inherently good thing. It's more an observation of the fact that it's not there. But I would argue that there is Well, and I guess, no, I'll pause there and say part of the reason why I'm not sure it's good or bad is because of the way that organizational structure is often discussed in print media, in that it's often used as a way to connect organizations together that shouldn't be connected together. For instance, we've seen media articles that connect Al-Qaeda and the Communist Party of Vietnam, which makes almost no sense. But they're doing it using organizational metaphors. They're doing it using a lot of these common network phrases and corporate phrases that imply that they are actually linked together. So but you also see the more explicit conversation of organizational structure, and I think that would be useful because, as we've seen throughout the day, when we start thinking about how, for instance, how the media is structured within ISIS. I thought that was absolutely fascinating, and I'd love to, if you get the chance to look more closely at that org chart that you have there. But I think that having a nuanced understanding of that kind of information actually would be useful. The question is, does the general public care?
Yeah, but I'm sort of thinking about the message, and everybody's been saying we need to demonstrate there's an alternative. And so if we started talking more about how this is not a well-organized outfit, or maybe it is, how they don't have a long-term plan. Again, we run into problems. As we talked about in the earlier panel, the U.S. doesn't seem to have a long-term policy. But how much of the propaganda do they spend on talking about how great their system of organization is?
Well, at the moment, not as much as they used to. But around the time of the Caliphate Declaration, they did spend a lot of time talking about, for example, schools, also media, also training camps, and the idea of amnesty as well, the institutions in place to integrate people who had been fighting against IS. The schools one I'll talk about in a little bit more detail because I think that demonstrates in pretty good detail how IS is trying to frame itself. So there's a 25-minute video that was released in 2014, fall of 2014, that spoke about the utter reconstruction of the schooling system in Raqqa province. And weirdly, it used a lot of footage from a BBC documentary that had been made about Ba'athist education in Syria, thank you, a few years before. But what they showed was a comprehensive, as they wanted to show it, comprehensive revolution of the schooling system. So interviews with current teachers that then went through a process of istitaba, process of repentance, and then being reintegrated into the schooling system and teaching this whole new curriculum. They show in great detail, actually, all the school books that are being used, all of the even the playgrounds. Schools are something which they've fetishized to a great degree because, again, it's a really good indicator, as they see it, of IS's statehood. So they do spend a lot of time talking about the how. The question is how much of that's actually true. So how many of these teachers in Raqqa actually did willingly pledge allegiance to Baghdadi and then hug their IS coercers and then go and work in a school again? Or
Do they spend much time talking about the leadership itself and how these people are the ones that are going to lead us down the righteous path and we need to follow them?
No.
Really?
I mean,
Interesting.
there are very few references in the everyday propaganda to the leadership of IS. They've even actually started, so there are a few big names in the IS military structure. The one I'm thinking of now is a guy called Abu Wahib. I urge you all to look at a photo of him on Google because he looks kind of like a comedy figure with his big kind of mop of hair and monobrow, and he's always kind of dressed up in funny military fatigues, trying out karate moves, things like that. But he was an individual who became quite a cultic figure for your everyday IS supporter. And he was shown at the forefront of military offensives in Iraq and then also in Syria as well. And then suddenly he stopped appearing completely. Now they've actually gone to, you can recognize him because of his bad hair. I'm not joking, you really, really can. They pixelate his face whenever he appears in a propaganda photo report because they don't want to bestow too much importance upon individual figures. So when they die, suddenly the momentum will be lost. Similar thing with Omar al-Shashani, a guy who was reported killed by the Pentagon a few weeks ago. They actually released a statement saying he hadn't been killed. Obviously, he hasn't appeared since, but it doesn't matter because he hasn't appeared in IS propaganda for years now. So they're aware of the fact that they have these leadership figures, but they're trying to take away the kind of cultic element of the appeal of these individuals. So if they do die, they can get past that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Victor Asal. So the first question is for Andrea and Ben, which is, could you specify more why the public discourse in America, differentiating Al-Qaeda and ISIS should matter from a policy perspective? I mean, you're arguing that it matters, right? That the portrayal here of these two organizations matter, certainly in the abstract. But what's the key takeaway from what you guys are analyzing here?
Well, so I think that as far as this particular presentation is concerned, the main reason we wanted to do that compare and contrast with Al-Qaeda wasn't necessarily because we think that there needs to be more effort to differentiate. That wasn't the main driving force. That may be a thing, and especially early on in the framing of Daesh, we definitely would argue there needed to be more differentiation between the two organizations. It was more as a tool so we can start to glance at where we see differences in the way it's being reported, so we can start to pinpoint areas where there might be issues. So that part of what we were able to get by comparing the two organizations is finding, for instance, the way that the threat was being discussed between the two organizations was starkly different. And being able to compare those differences and then comparing that with public opinion helps us to understand that that is an area where that might be helping to lead to the gap between what, for instance, the administration policy is and what people are actually wanting.
Okay, thanks. And then Charlie, so you're comparing Daesh to the Nazis. What?
Elements of.
Yeah, you're comparing them to the Nazis. Might there be utility in doing the same kind of comparison to other insurgency organizations to see who else is doing this, as well as the effectiveness or the implications of this? Because you can't really do that comparison between a whole state, which the Nazis were, and Daesh, which is a proto-state, but not really fully a state. But it could be very useful to do that kind of comparison to see how useful this kind of control is, this media control that you're talking about. And you might want to frame it more in terms of media control. You got at that when you were talking about how they play the radio, and you've got to listen to the radio whether you want to hear it or not, and then see how that type of control compares to other organizations that are trying to establish proto-states or have tried to establish proto-states in the past. That might be an interesting comparison, but also might give you a bigger payoff in terms of thinking about the utility of this for proto-states.
That's a really good point. It's actually something that Mia said to me a few weeks ago, so I probably should have actually done it. I think the Nazi example still serves because it does have these very kind of obvious elements in terms of communications alone that are shared across. It also is useful because, as I see it, IS currently as a military organization is not having as good a time as it was a few years ago. Indeed, it's being pushed back in Iraq and Syria and Libya and pretty much everywhere it's state to claim. So in terms of comparing the message that IS is putting across now with specifically the concept of Vergeltung, the retaliation thing that the Nazis really focused on a lot, I think, again, that's useful. But I do completely take your point. I think that would be a really interesting comparison. And one thing which I am very keen to get across is, of course, the topic of conversation here is IS, but other groups are doing it a lot. And they're also learning off each other. So, for example, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, they recently set up a new propaganda arm that looks exactly like IS's Amark agency, so right down to the way that it doesn't shroud everything in jihadi rhetoric. It prefers to use secular sounding stuff so it can look a little bit more neutral. It's something which is being done by extremist groups and non-extremist groups, insurgent groups across the board, and I think that would be a really rich thing to draw comparisons with. So I'll take your advice. Thank you.
My name is Mike Alvin. I'm an independent researcher. My question is for you, Mr. Winter. I assume that television doesn't penetrate these areas, but does radio penetrate? And if so, are they listening to SAWA or BBC or those kinds of things? Or are there alternative stations that the West has set up to penetrate the areas? And the other question is what about sports? What about football? Is there an attempt to promote the ever-popular soccer around? Are there clubs or competitions? Does Raqqa play Mosul, for example? Thank you.
I would love to know the answer to the second question. I don't think that that is the case. The only times I've seen sports facilities featuring in propaganda is if they're being blown up or executions are being staged in them. But, I mean, presumably people are still engaging in some sort of leisure in IS's claimed territories. But to the other question on television and radio, television through satellite is still penetrating into a lot of IS's territories. They're trying to crack down on it, but it's much easier said than done. And again, if they can get by with satellite television still sticking to narratives that actually support what they're saying, then that's okay. So if they focus on, if their propaganda is focusing on what happens in Tikrit or Ramadi after it was captured from IS, and then if people are actually going to satellite television, that's actually backing up the claims made in IS propaganda. That's significant. When it comes to radio, there is still other FM signals that are getting through. An interesting example of what IS is trying to do to undermine this is in Mosul last year, there was a very popular Kurdish radio station that was continuing to broadcast into Mosul. I think it was a pop music station. That's not very caliphate friendly. So they tried to muscle this other radio station off the airwaves by essentially taking its frequency and broadcasting a more powerful signal in order to be the loudest and be the biggest, take the most amount of airwave space. So there is still other media that is getting into IS territories, but IS is trying to disproportionately hog the airwaves, if you like.
And I have one question for Ben and Andrea, which was, when you show the graph that Americans are less confident their government can protect them, I want to ask you, are we sure that's a bad result? Because every meeting I go to, practically everybody says, well, terrorism, there's no 100% solution. And there is no real protection. So what if Americans are actually learning what people at meetings like this have been saying for years? And for Charlie, I'd like to ask, well, when you talk about the civilian life representations, I can imagine those falling into carrots versus sticks. Good positive things that they're doing for the people as opposed to scenes of people being punished or even executed for not supporting the Islamic State. So I wonder what the proportion of those, the carrots and the sticks, might be in what you look at, and whether that proportion might have changed over time.
Well, Clark, I don't think that I think you have a very good point there, and but you might be being a little bit more optimistic about the American public than I might be. But I think the larger point is that there is a severe disconnect between the public and the elite as far as the current administration strategy. And whether the public is right or the administration is right is really up for debate. The larger point is that there's a severe disconnect, and that we argue that disconnect comes from how the media is reporting on the terrorist threat.
I'm just going to add on to that, where it's basically, we're not going to take a stance, but we do know that disconnect exists. So it's either that the administration has to change policies to match what the public is is basically thinking, or what we perceive the public to be thinking, or that we need to work to make sure the public has a better and more nuanced understanding. Either the public is right, or the administration is right, or somewhere in the middle. But right now, there's too far of a disconnect for it to really be a reasonable position to be in.
Good question. So I did a study last year where I downloaded and translated all officially produced IS propaganda that was disseminated in the month of Shawwal. So that's the 17th of July until the 15th of August, if I recall correctly. So after translating it, putting it in a database and coding it, and kind of running it through these narratives, these themes, I could break down within the civilian life narrative what the focus was for each of those things. So I can give you some actual numbers for it, which aren't necessarily reflective of what it is now exactly, but do say what it was in Shawwal 1436 or July, August 2015. So there were, first of all, 892 individual propaganda events during that month. So that is a photo report or an audio message or a video, not just one photo here or there, but a kind of, there's been an editorial decision behind the production of that event. So out of those 892, 469 of them were focused on civilian life. And out of those 469, the theme was kind of split between local services, religion, economic activity, so industry, justice, and this is the hand cutting off, the beheadings, that kind of thing, nature, social life, and camaraderie, essentially. Over half of those, actually 3/4 of those were focused, so 3/4 of 469, if you can keep up with me, sorry. I wish I had percentages. 3/4 of them were focused on local services, religious services, and economic activity. So these are things like tires being made in a tire factory or an alabaster factory, or prayer services, people handing out zakat, essentially benefits, to poor people, roads being cleaned, electricity pylons being fixed, that kind of thing. So the justice side of it, the people having their hands cut off or being beheaded, that appeared a lot less. But of course, measuring impact of these things is another thing. So perhaps the images or videos of people being beheaded had more propaganda clout when they're actually being consumed by the consumer, whether offline or online. But again, this is Shawwal last year, and a lot of water has gone under the bridge since. And even just kind of on an anecdotal basis, on an unsystematic conclusions drawn from looking at the last 6 months of IS propaganda, which I did the other week, there has been some big changes in terms of what IS is portraying to the rest of the world. For example, more military propaganda, but more of a focus on defense than offense, more of a focus on anti-aircraft weaponry, that kind of thing. But again, like I said earlier, there was an ice cream photo report earlier, that there is still this focus on utopia, this focus on civilian life. And I will eventually come out with a kind of updated study of the Shawwal thing, which should be richer because it will be many more months than just that one.
Okay. Final question, Risa, please.
I'm wondering, Charlie, whether you think that ISIS is sowing the seeds of its own delegitimation in this. It's really hard to provide public services and schools and do all of that, right? So the image and the reality are, it's a stark reminder to all the people viewing that propaganda that the reality is, unless they can pull it off, which seems unlikely, is that an important theme that we should be thinking about and how to counter them. And then the other thing it's more an observation. It seems to me you might have something to say to these discussions about whether online social relationships are the same as in-person social relationships. Because part of what seems to be going on here is that some of these activities are community-centric, right? They're face-to-face interaction. They're reinforcing those kinds of social bonds, which is different than online relationships. So I'm wondering if you've thought about that at all.
Yeah, I think, so to take it in reverse order, I think that there is a a focus, perhaps too much of a focus, on delivering great counter-narrative or counter-messaging content online, because that's where all of the radicalization is happening, that's where all the people are being recruited. But I think actually it would serve a lot more to engage offline, not have this focus on producing cool, shiny videos to mirror what IS is doing, but focus more on actually engaging with people on a community basis. And really, I really want to stress that I think that personal relationships, real-world relationships, and local engagement is a much better, potentially more fruitful way than just focusing on videos. Of course, I do think that there's room for counter-messaging media as well. In terms of whether they're kind of spelling their own disaster by focusing so much on this impossible utopia, yes and no. I think it depends who you're looking at in terms of the target audience. So for the ideological supporters of the group who have traveled to IS, to join IS, to live in its caliphate, to live in this real-world implementation of an Islamic utopia, as IS sells it, it is harmful to be focusing so much on the civilian side of things and then not providing it. But for the individuals that aren't proactive IS supporters, but who are living under IS because it's the least worst option, I think that it's equally important and equally effective even if the audience is incredulous, because they are trying to create this unreality. And this is, again, something which the Nazis did and the Soviets did as well, trying to kind of really debilitate the audience, mock the audience by showing them these things that weren't actually happening, but just to show the level of the extent of control that they have over the civilian population. So I think yes and no, but probably more on the side of yes. So it's kind of a positive note to finish on.
Okay. An interesting day, how to find a positive note. Right, so this brings us to today's close. We will reconvene tomorrow, breakfast from 8. First session is at 8:45. I want to thank all our speakers today and everybody that's participated. I think it's been a very good day, and I hope everybody else feels the same. But most importantly, I want you to join me in thanking our three speakers for a very engaging discussion at the end.